Everyone, welcome back to the Command Your Brand Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, the CEO and co-founder of Command Your Brand. We help brands to make a big impact in the new media world. You can grab our new podcast book over at bestpodcastbook.com. Reminder before we jump into today's conversation, if you are brand new to this channel or to this show, to like this video, leave us a comment, and smash that subscribe button if you want to command your brand. And today we're going to get into a health topic, which, as you guys know, something I have spent my entire life on. So these are always very, very interesting to me. And it's interesting because I look at my late 30s is very different than my, early 20s and whatnot as well, and how I treat my body. And I look at those things a lot differently. And we have Dr. Scott Vrzal with us today, and we're going to take a look at, a lot of the science behind headaches and how it's treating the body. And I think we're going to have a really great conversation today. So Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here. Fun subject. Definitely a passion of mine.
So Dr. Vrzal, for people that may not be familiar with you, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, sir.
Yeah, well, I got into healthcare because of the headaches I was having as a kid. And I was a natural bodybuilder originally, and doing everything I could to be healthy and be well, and was being plagued by these things that were not allowing me to work out. And so, that was very much my passion. Found some tools to really identify where those triggers would come from. We'll talk a lot about that, hopefully, and put it all together. But yeah, I've always been into health, and figured the better I understood the body, the better I can feel, the more I can get out of this thing called life.
Very cool. And it's funny. I know for me, powerlifting and natural bodybuilding and stuff has always been a big part of my life. And literally, I'm barely not a midget. Like, I'm 5'6". So for me, a lot of those movements were a lot easier because the distance was very short. So I can totally understand that background. I guess when we look at it, Dr. Vrzal, what is the significance in, I guess, identifying specific patterns in headaches, like migraines and things? What should we be looking at, and how important are those patterns?
Right. So my unique offering is the fact that really whittled it down to 7 different patterns. There are literally 7 different patterns or locations that every headache is going to fit into. And so each of those locations tells a different story, tells of a gland or organ that's going to be compromised. So whether people call them migraines or, genetic or any of that sort of stuff, tell me whether it's a right-sided, a left-sided, frontal, back of the head. I call this cyclops. Those are all patterns, or then there's a hormonal headache. So those identify that location, and not only does it tell what gland or organ is compromised, the reason my book is called Headache Advantage is because that tells me really where the priority is for that person's health. So each of those locations says, if they've got, a list of 15 different symptoms, and one of those is a right-sided headache, for example, I know gallbladder is where we're going to start. We're going to start fixing that gallbladder, and that'll take care of most of the lion's share of those other 15 symptoms, for example.
That's so interesting. So, because I think when we think about it, we look at a headache as a headache, right? And what I'm curious, what causes the body to have, I guess, these different kind of centers of the body cause a headache? How does that? I'm sure that's very broad, but I guess how does that work in terms of operation?
Yeah, the easiest way to look at it is really the acupuncture meridians, and that's ultimately where I initially discovered most of the patterns. Because there's the stomach, the gallbladder meridian, for example, does kind of a ram horn around the right side of the head, both sides, but it's a right-sided organ. Then the stomach meridian starts underneath the eye, does a lot of that same thing. So I use those meridians to identify, and they seem to have more relevance in location of pain, even more so than nerves and that sort of stuff. I've had patients with diagnosed trigeminal neuralgia, for example, which is all nerves all on the side of the head, and they were blaming all that, and it still came down to a stomach issue, for example. So we fix the stomach, get that working better, and even the nerves function better. So it all fits together. Everybody knows, if you have a left-sided shoulder pain, then, holy moly, it's a heart issue, right?
Right.
So, everybody's familiar with referred pain area, but nobody had really put it together with the headache patterns. And so that's really kind of the unique offering, or what we have to look for, what a person can learn in the Headache Advantage book.
So let me ask you this, because then I'm curious, you've worked with a lot of people, you've been studying this for many years. Is there one of those causes that's more common in most people? And if so, like what causes that cause? Do you know what I mean? Like what causes that thing that's causing the headache?
Right. So, for most common is a right-sided headache, which is a gallbladder issue. The gallbladder is a right-sided organ, and so we look at gallbladder function for that. Second most common is a left-sided headache. That tends to be a stomach issue. Stomach is a left-sided organ. So if a person has a right-sided headache, we're looking at what triggers, what abnormalities are causing the gallbladder to misfunction. And then it gets into, it could be as unique as tomatoes, for example. Tomatoes can compromise the way the gallbladder functions in a lot of people. And so simply cutting tomatoes out in that example can reduce or eliminate the triggers of that right-sided headache, for example. Then there's also certainly nutrients, things like choline or B2 riboflavin that also helps the gallbladder function. So we look at those nutrients. Every gland or organ, when it's compromised, has either a structural trigger, which is where chiropractic comes into play. Physical therapy and that sort of stuff has a chemical trigger. In other words, a food or supplement, food or toxin that they're exposed to, supplemental need, or even an emotional trigger. So there's even emotions associated with each of those glands and organs. So in this right-sided example, being the primary most common headache, those emotions are like anger, frustration, resentment. Those tend to get stored in the liver or the gallbladder. So it might be that we need to help a person release some of that, and then that can get rid of their headaches.
Let me ask you this too, because I'm curious. When we look at, because interestingly enough, like, and you can correct me on any of this if I'm wrong, but like, as far as I understand, like the stomach and the gallbladder are also like a big part of digestion as well.
Yeah.
So is food quality a big motivator in that too? Because our food quality in the last like 100 years has like really been destroyed in this country.
Right. You want to go down that road too. You wanted to keep this to 20 minutes, you said?
Hey, if we go long, we go long. We're out there to help people.
We are indeed. So yeah, 100%. Food quality is dismal. It's getting worse. And in the right-sided headache example, glyphosate, the pesticide, the toxin in Roundup, is a very common trigger that inhibits bile production, for example, and it also literally obliterates the intestinal lining. So intestinal is kind of a full headband type of a headache. Right-sided headache is a gallbladder issue. So either of those can be triggered by Roundup, the pesticide that unfortunately is still used very rampantly in America, in all those non-GMO foods, non-genetically modified foods that we're exposed to. So yes, going organic, I'm all about getting organic because that has thousands of times the amount of minerals in it. Non-organics can have the Roundup. It's going to be genetically modified. It's going to have fewer minerals. Certainly not going to be health inducing. So it takes work really to be healthy, and to make good choices in this world that we're living in right now. Living out on the farm and growing your own, is a great start, but not a lot of us can do that.
Let me ask you, because I'm curious. For most people, like I'm sure there's a lot of difficulty in this, but like for someone that's experiencing like chronic headaches, like I had mentioned to you before we started recording. So like when I was younger, my mom had really debilitating migraines, and it actually like turned out to be like a whole hormonal thing because she had some issues that had to get handled. But like, I guess when we're looking at identifying, like what the pattern is or what the triggers are, like how do we go about that, or what does the process look like for identifying like what our patterns or what our triggers are like?
Right. So, my first question when a person tells me that they have a headache in the office is the location. It's all about location, location, location. That was my original title for the book because location is everything. So in your mom's case, if it was called hormonal, then that typically is going to be what I call bitemporal, or both sides. And so when hormones are out of whack, that's what's going to cause that location of a headache. So then we back up from there and look at why are the hormones out of whack, for example. And oftentimes that's because the liver is not breaking down. Estrogen is a huge one. There's about 5 different pathways in the liver that need to break down estrogen. People talk about estrogen dominance, for example. It could likely be because there's a methylation pathway in the liver that's not breaking it down properly. So we get some B12 going, or get that pathway uncongested, if you will, and then that'll allow those headaches to get better. From the wow, the oh no kind of perspective, that same methylation pathway it activates the tumor suppressor gene. So when that pathway is not functioning right, then we lose the ability. In other words, it's under functioning, and we lose the ability to suppress tumor cells, right? So
Wow.
then that big like, oh no, right? So all right, it's not just a little nuisance of a headache anymore. It's like, hey, we need to head this off before we have more dire consequences.
Mm-hmm. And I guess when we're looking at that, like once we've identified it, I guess what does the protocol look like for solving it then? Because as you mentioned, like there's it could be hormonal, there's some dietary issues, there could be environmental issues. And I guess like, so once we've identified that, what does kind of that protocol look like for solving it? And then I guess as well, like, since we don't want to cause it again, like how should our lifestyle actions change after that?
Yeah, perfect. So that's where the fun part as a clinician is helping a person identify those triggers. In that methylation example I just used, I mean, it could be as simple as taking a good B12 supplement. Methylcobalamin is the active form of B12. So it could be as simple as taking B12 now, till death do us part, so to speak, or folic acid. Those are very big in helping that pathway work. Could be as simple as, hey, chill out on the pesticide-laden foods that are inhibiting that methylation pathway. Toxic metals are another very common thing that inhibit that methylation pathway. So the fun part clinically or through a book like The Headache Advantage, figure out or identify those triggers, get them out of the life, and then the headaches are done, gone. Thing. Yesterday's news.
So I guess when you're looking at solving something like that, like we live in an instant solution society, Dr. Vrzal, right? Like everybody wants an immediate solution. They want a pill for every ill. And I guess when you look at it, if we're actually solving a chronic program of headaches, like what kind of a time period would look like start getting relief on something like that?
Yeah. So my bragging point is, and it sounds maybe a little overconfident, but it's really what gives me the confidence in putting this sort of material together. Literally, a headache never leaves my office. So is that fast enough?
Wow. But I guess what about getting back into that chronic pattern though, right? Like, because you mentioned it might be like, okay, so we're low on B12 or we're low on this, we're low on that. Like, are we looking at like a period of weeks or months, or like what is, I guess to start seeing like long-term changes, what are we looking at? Like, I know obviously depending on what kind of headache it is, I'm sure it's different, but like, what have you seen?
Yeah. Great question. The reality is, I kind of made the fun quip that a headache never leaves the office. It gives me the confidence that, this is the right trigger. This is what the cause is. Then life happens, right? So we can get rid of the trigger, tell them to chill out on tomatoes. They can never have a headache ever, or they may go splurge and have tomatoes because it was pasta night with the family. And then it comes back, then they realize, oh, that is the trigger. Then it's a conscious volitional choice, right? Is it worth hanging out with the family, having tomato to have a headache tomorrow, right? So that's really the understanding, or really doctor as a teacher teaching the person what the triggers are, so that then it's a choice. Most of the time we can get rid of those headaches pretty much altogether, or even have a supplemental antidote, if you will, that, hey, if you feel a headache coming on, it's right-sided, take this beet-based product to help thin the bile and get rid of it. And I can get rid of it right away without having to turn to, drugs or anti-inflammatories.
I'm curious as well, like, everything shows sugar laden, right? And, the high fructose corn syrup's even worse. And I know some of the artificial sweeteners can also like stimulate your blood sugar in like a similar fashion. I'm curious when we're looking at kind of how much sugar we're having in our diet, is that also playing a part in headaches as well? Like the amount of sugar we're consuming on a daily basis?
Massive trigger. And sugar is ultimately going to exaggerate pretty much any other trigger that is going on. Pastor I used to be under, had headaches every Monday, and that Mondays are traditionally a pastor's day off, and he'd eat sugar most of the day. So that was his primary trigger. Praise God, I was fortunate enough to recognize at 14 years old that sugar didn't work well for me, and I cut it out completely. Haven't really had refined sugar since that time. So yes, that is in the first part of the book. We talk about artificial sweeteners, and we talk about sugar as massive triggers. Artificial sweeteners are actually a neurotoxin, which means they can literally kill brain cells. set up dementia and failing memory and depression. So definitely a big fan of trying to get those out of the diet. Structurally, artificial sweeteners cause a weakness of the quads. So a person trying to run or do squats
Oh,
or that type
wow.
of stuff. Yeah. So the physical manifestation of them is it messes up the internal biota, the gut bacteria, especially in the small intestine. And so that's what sets up the weakness in those quad muscles. So it could manifest in, somebody come in with knee pain. In fact, I've had this a lot where my cycling buddies would chew gum to keep their sinuses open while they're riding, but then they'd have knee pain. So get them off of the artificial sweeteners, and then that knee pain goes away.
Yeah, and all that gum chewing, maybe some TMJ issues too, right?
Right.
I'm curious as well, like, for being somebody with a fitness background, are there also things that I guess maybe we're doing to ourselves, maybe even correctly, like in the gym, that are also causing a lot of these issues too, and maybe we should consider, I guess, a different way of operation?
Right. And so I see it all day, every day. It's because I had an auto accident, right? Or it's because, I slipped when I was doing my clean jerks or, any of that squats. The reality is there was a muscle weakness that set that up in the first place. And so, if a person like in my early days, I was doing bench press and my right arm was always lagging behind and trying to get the bench up. Kept my max down because of that, and turned out it was because of my pec was weak because of the stomach wasn't functioning properly, and so actually it was a left-sided lag because the stomach's a left-sided organ. So I started a supplement to help my stomach function, and I could bench more weight and more balanced and symmetrical. So every muscle has an associated gland or organ with it. So typically there's an predisposing weakness in that gland or organ that then sets up the physical, blowout of the knee, for example, or the shoulder, because there was an underlying weakness that predisposed that or set it up.
It's funny. In my early 20s, I was a personal trainer, and bench press is one of those exercises that, like, you're always kind of appalled when you see like 90% of people doing it, because they're up so high they're actually doing a rotator cuff press and a deltoid press rather than actually activating any pectorals at all. And you're like, oh man, that is you are looking for a shoulder surgery coming soon, man. There's the number of people I've seen doing that is kind of wild.
Yes, and those muscles are tiny, right? I mean, activate the big old pec muscle as opposed to that tiny little supraspinatus or infraspinatus muscle. Yeah, for sure.
I'm curious in all your research, what has been, I guess, the most surprising thing in your field that you've learned in all your research?
A lot. I mean, just the whole muscle organ correlation is just so phenomenal. It opens up the world really to figuring out. I mean, every day I get people coming in. I've had chronic neck pain ever since my auto accident, and they've had chiropractic, they've been adjusted, but nobody addressed, for example, the emotional aspect. Let's talk about Johnny, this kid that I treated that he'd been hit by a car. And
oh my gosh.
And so we had to deal with all the physical manifestations, his back pain, his neck pain, and that sort of stuff. He was in grade school. And so his mom says, hey, Johnny's doing great now. Physically, we got his neck doing well and his back and so on. But his grades have really tanked ever since this happened. And I said, well, what do we know about it? And she said, well, he's been diagnosed colorblind. And I said, well, what does that mean? She said, and he's red.
And he wasn't colorblind before this point? Like it was like a new thing?
Right. He was not colorblind before the accident. Right. And so I said, well, what? And she said, he's green and blue colorblind. And I said, well, that's not true colorblind. What's up there? And so I said, Johnny, what do you remember about the accident? And he says, well, I was walking on a green light and it was a blue minivan that hit me.
Oh my gosh. There you go.
Right. And so we did some work to reduce the manifestation, the physical manifestation of those colors ultimately in the accident. And boom, his grades went back up to A's and B's, and Johnny lived happily ever after. So even emotions, I mean, every day I get, oh, my neck's been hurting ever since the accident. And then, and they get treated, they get adjusted, they feel good. And then they see another red Honda and boom, their neck goes back out. So we can desensitize even to those physical manifestations of emotions.
Well, what's interesting too is like you think of whenever you like brace for something, right? Like you brace that something's going to happen, like you clinch or you grab something. And it's like, I'm like, how often do we just never let that stress go too, right? Like how often does that just sit there because, we don't want to get hit again, right?
Right. Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
I guess looking at it, like I can see what you're saying, and it's so important, right? But I guess a lot of practitioners aren't willing to look at that connection. And I guess, why do you think that is?
Having the tools. I mean, that's a lot of why I got into it, because I was told I was crazy because, I didn't have an aneurysm causing my headaches, right? It's my platform really is, it's really very frustrating that people are told that it's because of their genetics or because of, their injury or, these things, when the doctor doesn't have the answer. So, I took it upon myself really to have tools to figure those answers out. And, there's an approach called applied kinesiology that puts all the structural, chemical, emotional stuff together, that really kind of gave me the tools to figure all this out. And so that's my frustration, is that hearing these people that have been suffering for years because, Dr. X didn't have the tools or didn't want to take the extra effort to figure out really what the triggers were.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Vrzal, I've really enjoyed this conversation. For people listening, if they want to connect with you or if they want to grab the book, how's going to be the best way for people listening to do that?
Right. So social media, Vrzal is my last name. You can find me on social. Book is coming soon. The website, the landing page for that is headacheadvantage.com. On that page, you'll be able to pick up the book. Ultimately, there's also links to pick up supplements or help kind of identify the causes of a headache based on the location. So those are some good tools to give people the opportunity to move forward with this information and apply it to their lives so that they don't have to suffer like I did as a kid.
Very cool. Dr. Scott Vrzal, thank you so much for hanging out with me today, sir.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening and watching, a reminder, if you have not liked this video, hit that like button, leave us a comment, smash that subscribe button if you want to command your brand and make a bigger impact out there. Have a great one, everybody.